Hello, everyone. My name is Maya Garcia. Today, we have a chance to speak with Ms. Allison Pytlak, who is the Program Manager in Disarmament for Women's International League for Peace and Freedom at Reaching Critical Wealth. Based on her valuable experience, we believe that Mrs. Pytlak is the right person to speak about how COVID-19 has affected gender-based violence. Our interview is divided into 3 parts, and my colleagues Lucy Gamba and Deepa Mani and I will go through them gradually.
Thank you very much for inviting me to speak with you today. It's really a pleasure to be here and to talk through and unpack some of these issues and these questions.
My first question is, how would you define the relationship between small arms and light weapons and gender-based violence within the last 5 years?
I think the answer to this depends a little bit on what you mean by relationship. Small arms and light weapons are, as they almost always have been, used to commit and to facilitate gender-based violence, or GBV. The possession and use of small arms and light weapons has been demonstrated to directly cause GBV, but also to indirectly cause and reinforce gender inequality. Small arms and light weapons, or SALW, is the category of weapons most implicated in human rights violations in general and gender-based violence in particular. In fact, the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women has repeatedly recognized the detrimental impact of SALW on women and girls, including those arms that have been diverted and transferred illicitly. So maybe just to unpack this term GBV a bit for your audiences, what does that mean? I think when you hear this word, one thinks most immediately of physical or sexual violence, but there are also other forms of gender-based violence. There is emotional and psychological gender-based violence. This is things like abuse, humiliation, intimidation, and confinement. There's also socioeconomic gender-based violence, which is the discrimination or denial of opportunities and services, or the prevention of the exercise and enjoyment of our civil, social, economic, cultural, and political rights on the basis of gender. And in order to really understand the harm that is caused by SALW in relation to these different forms of GBV, it's important to acknowledge that they do not always need to be discharged. The weapon doesn't always need to be discharged to have an impact on the enjoyment of human rights or to cause a form of gender-based violence. Sometimes just their presence at home or in the community and the threat or the implied threat of their use can be sufficient to have a severe impact on human rights or to commit or facilitate gender-based violence. So I don't know necessarily if the relationship between these things is changing. Definitely the scale of violence increases and decreases in different locations over time. But what has definitely changed is the level of awareness within the small arms and arms control community about gender. And the reason why I'm making air quotes is because the word gender has come to encompass a really wide spectrum of topics and also a wide spectrum of priorities and goals when we talk about it in the small arms space. So one of these dimensions of the issue is talking about the gendered impacts of small arms and light weapons. How do they impact people differently on the basis of a person's gender? Another area of interest is around women's participation and representation in small arms control work and improving gender diversity therein. And the spectrum, I think it also ranges, from some work that focuses on women alone to other efforts to really unpack what is meant by gender in its widest meaning. There's also efforts to break past binary understandings of gender. There's discussions about what is gender-sensitive small arms control versus gender transformative small arms control. And then once in a while, we also hear the word feminism, usually from WILP, getting thrown into the mix. And maybe just to close off this question, that this awareness, this newfound awareness in the small arms community about gendered impacts and gender diversity and participation, it's manifesting in a lot of different ways. We're seeing increased research and information sharing from UN agencies, civil society, small arms control experts, and government. There is significantly more funding available for work in this area, which is generating more practical work, including trainings, guidance manuals, data collection, etc. And there's also much greater political championing by governments to include language on gender in UN documents, whether they be resolutions or outcomes from specific conferences, and also within their own national work.
What is the impact of small arms and light weapons on gender issues concerning gender-based violence?
Well, I think it's important to remember that gender-based violence is the most prevalent form of violence in the world, and it's also highly underreported. And the reason why I make this point is to underscore that this is a problem everywhere for all countries and for all societies, even if at some times we might hear more about arms and GBV in some places than we do in others. Violence and gender-based violence is rooted in discrimination and inequality, and that interacts with individual attitudes, beliefs, and practices. It also interacts with broader social norms around gender and violence, and it also interacts with the systems and the structures that prop up and sometimes, in some cases, concretize this inequality and discrimination. In WILP's perspective, we've long recognized that the possession of weapons symbolizes a concept of power that stems from a very particular and dominant understanding of masculinity. And this is based on gender norms in which ideas like strength, courage, and protection are equated with violence. And this is not to say that all men are violent or that all women are peaceful, but that this is a prevailing behavioral and societal norm. And this understanding of the role of gender norms as part of militarized or violent masculinity is starting to gain some traction within arms control. And that's really, I think, important to changing how we approach this conversation about GBV and about small arms or firearms. It's really scratching beneath the surface and helping us to get a bigger picture of what is causing the problem. So for example, in May of 2018, the UN Secretary General, he released an agenda for disarmament. And in that, he recognized that, quote, concerns relating to arms have clear gender dimensions. The ownership and use of arms is closely linked to expressions of masculinity related to control, power, domination, and strength. And also earlier this year, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a report that looks at the international arms trade and the impact of small arms and light weapons on women and girls. And in this report, the High Commissioner also notes that the ownership and use of arms relate really closely to specific expressions of masculinity, power, and control that further gender-based discrimination against women and girls. And the report also highlights that addressing gendered root causes of violence is essential.
Do you believe that there is room in this agreement for amendments or for additional steps to be taken to counter gender-based violence a little bit more effectively?
For listeners who haven't followed the Arms Trade Treaty closely, it is an international legally binding instrument, a treaty agreed in 2013 through the UN General Assembly. And the treaty, it has many dimensions, but at its heart, it obligates its states parties to undertake a series of risk assessments, mostly for exporting states parties, but there are also requirements for importing countries and transit countries. But they need to do a risk assessment of what are the different risks of the arms that they want to transfer in the recipient country. And included among that list is the risk of committing or facilitating gender-based violence. And this is, it was really a great victory to get this language in the treaty. At that time, I was actually working with the Control Arms Coalition, so also on the Arms Trade Treaty, but not looking very specifically at the gender-based violence work in the way that WILP, Amnesty, the IANSA Women's Network, and others were really advocating to see this included. And it was an uphill battle. There was not a lot of appetite from governments to see this. I think there was a great quote from one government who said, what next? Do you want to have fishermen included in the treaty? Like, you're trying to get everything you can in there. But we do have the provision now, and that's really, really important. But what is lacking has been an implementation of this provision as part of Article 7.4. Now, WILP has produced different resources over the last 5 or 6 years to give guidance to states parties. How do you do a risk assessment for gender-based violence? What questions do you ask? What data sources would be good ones? Other organizations are now also publishing guidance in this area. Control Arms has done some training with export licensing officers that I was lucky enough to participate in. And we're really trying, I think, to unpack knowledge about GBV and how do you look for it? Because for many of the people making the decisions on whether or not to grant the export permit, this is something new for them, or they don't have the information that they need readily available to them. So to answer your question, I don't think we need an amendment. And actually, I think if we open the treaty up, there will probably be all kinds of other amendments. But I do think that we need to see better implementation of what is already in the instrument. And in addition to that, in 2019, when ATT states parties met for their 5th annual Conference of States Parties, they agreed to a new series of agreements and commitments related to gender and related to gender-based violence. And it was really great because in the lead up to their agreeing these commitments, there was a lot of material produced on this topic. There was a lot of trainings, there were side events, new publications. So I think it really helped to foster better understanding, at least amongst the diplomats following Arms Trade Treaty. But now that information needs to get disseminated to the people who are implementing it in their national capitals.
How do you see the relationship between small arms and light weapons and gender-based violence in the next 5 to 10 years?
We've talked just now about the Arms Trade Treaty, but there are also decisions and commitments that have been made recently in the context of the UN Program of Action on Small Arms and Light Weapons. There's not actually gender language really in the instrument itself, but in subsequent documents that have been issued by states, there are now. There's also, different UN Security Council resolutions that together make up the Women, Peace, and Security agenda that have relevance for small arms control, gender-based violence in the arms trade. And there's also different General Assembly resolutions. This nexus of topics is somewhat addressed through the Sustainable Development Goals too. So I think there's no shortage of instruments, but like to my earlier point, I think what we need to see is better implementation of those commitments. Maybe there's also some scope to do additional work with existing instruments that are gender blind, that were drafted and adopted before there was this great awareness of this dimension of the problem. So maybe there's work to be done to sort of transform the content or implementation of those. And then I think that, maybe also to my earlier point is just closing this gap between what is being pledged and agreed to in UN meeting rooms and the knowledge and understanding and actions of the governmental counterparts left to implement those pledges.
What are your observations in regards to gender-based gun violence in countries at peace and countries with armed conflict? And if there is a shift, do you believe that this change is significant and long-lasting?
Great questions. Well, I think to the earlier point that gender-based violence is a problem everywhere. And so this means that it's also a problem in countries at peace and countries with armed conflict. That said, there is research that shows that in highly or more militarized countries or locations or contexts, possibly also places that are post-conflict as well, there are often higher levels of gender-based violence, whether that is committed with a gun or another kind of small arm or light weapon or otherwise. And this has been a long-standing pattern. If we look back in history a little bit, research tells us that the increased availability of guns during the conflict in Northern Ireland correlated with more dangerous forms of domestic violence at that time. A similar trend was observed in Côte d'Ivoire in 2011, where during the armed conflict, rates of reported domestic violence rose by 43%. Recently, one of our partners at WILP, who's working in Iraq, an organization called Asuda, they have a report coming out in early 2021 that looks at the correlation in 4 cities between the rise of violence against women and the increased availability and acquisition of firearms there. Why is this the case? I think, the reasons are probably context specific, but there are sometimes similarities. Ownership of a firearm or another weapon, it becomes more normalized in times of violence or times of conflict, and violent behavior itself becomes more normalized. And I don't want to say more accepted, but I think it becomes, like I said, more normalized. There might also be easier access to firearms because they've been left behind during the conflict, after a conflict. They're insecure, they're easier to get, or things like background checks and licensing procedures don't exist. In some cases, there are more incentives to acquire a weapon because of concerns about protection. What we know is that contexts of violence and conflict really exacerbate gender norms and roles and discrimination in ways in which males are usually viewed as or encouraged to act as combatants or fighters or as protectors, and females are seen more as in need of protection and as vulnerable. But at the same time, we shouldn't forget the role of small arms and light weapons, and especially guns and firearms in the relationship to gender-based violence in non-conflict settings too. In 2016, Amnesty International reported that 4.5 million women in the United States have been threatened by an abuser with a firearm, and 1 million of those have been shot or injured or shot at without injury. And this is also true of transgender people in the United States. In 2017, the number of transgender people killed increased further to at least 29 deaths, and 17 of those were from gunshots. There's also a lot of research out there looking at the role of youth, and specifically young men, in gang or crime-related violence in countries that are otherwise considered to be at peace. So this isn't an everywhere problem, but addressing the problem is probably not going to be a one-size-fits-all solution or approach. Policymakers can and should learn from what has worked well in one place, try to apply it elsewhere if that makes sense. But ultimately, I think that successful policies and responses to armed violence and GBV really need to understand local contexts and dynamics and be rooted in a gender analysis.
Based on the Gender Responsive Small Arms Control Practical Guide from 2019, disconnect between local and global perspectives, the lived experience of GBV, gender discrimination, or poverty are rarely heard in the UN conference room. This is where civil society often play a critical role in disseminating information, reminding states of their commitment, and bridging gaps. How is Women International League for Peace and Freedom trying to fill in the gap between the local and global? Or in other words, what is Women International League for Peace and Freedom approach in tackling the issue of disconnection between local and global in regards of gender-based violence?
Super questions. Well, local to global is a key principle or a working method for WILPs. You may not know that in addition to our international secretariat, which is where I work in its disarmament program, we have close to 40 national sections all around the world, as well as several national groups, local chapters, and individual members. So when we say that we are taking a local to global approach, and then back again, actually, we want to do this to bridge gaps and inspire more effective responses. So those of us who are working in the international secretariats in New York or in Geneva, we're trying to bring and facilitate a flow of information and recommendations from women peace activists to the multilateral fora at the UN or elsewhere that we're covering. And at the same time, also bring information about what's happening in those forums back to our national sections and partners on the ground so that they can work with that and try to influence at the local or national level. It's a cyclical way of working. So to give you a specific example, earlier I mentioned that in 2019, the Arms Trade Treaty Conference of States Parties and its preparatory meetings took this focus on gender and gender-based violence. So in the lead up to the conference, it was myself and my colleagues in the Secretariat who were attending most of the meetings in Geneva. But our interventions there were informed by what interested WILP sections had to say about the agenda items. And so to give a very specific example, there was at that time some discussion amongst ATT states parties about what is gender-based violence. Can all forms of gender-based violence be related to the arms trade? And does that also include all of the weapons that are included in the arms trade treaty? Is there a link between all of those weapons and gender-based violence in all of its forms? So sections, WILP sections in 3 countries, they prepared research based on what they've seen and heard about how different kinds of weapons beyond small arms and light weapons are linked to GBV. These were our sections in the DRC, in Burkina Faso, and in Cameroon. And we published those and we circulated them to ATT states parties. We also organized a 1-day training ahead of the CSP5 on gender and GBV, in which our representative from our section in the DRC gave recommendations to the diplomats. And we had a wider delegation of women from Colombia, Sri Lanka, the DRC and Burkina Faso come to CSP5. They met with governments, they spoke on panels and side events, and they gave input to the draft decisions that were being considered by governments on gender and GBV.
How are the insecurities created as a result of COVID-19 different for men and women? And if so, how?
Great question. And I think that this has sort of been making a lot of headlines over the last couple of months, but maybe not everyone is really sure of what this means. Excuse me. So to answer this question, I think we need to go once again back to what we talked about earlier about gender norms and roles and power. The gender-based insecurities that have been created by or relate to the COVID-19 pandemic, they have their basis in those norms. COVID-19 is a crisis, and crises exacerbate pre-existing risks and inequalities. So women and men have had different experiences of insecurity on this time as a byproduct of their gender and the roles that they play related to that. So to give some concrete examples, in April of 2020, the UN Secretary General, he put out a policy brief that was already in April looking at the impacts of COVID-19 on women. And maybe this is very specific to women and not like gender writ large, but just to share some of them. He noted that COVID-19 has compounded the economic impacts that are being felt, especially by women and girls who are earning less, saving less, and holding insecure jobs or living closer to poverty. He noted that early reports revealed that more men were dying as a result of the virus, that the health of women generally has been adversely impacted through the reallocation of resources and priorities, including sexual and reproductive health services. It's been noted widely that unpaid care work, which usually falls to women to do, has increased with children out of school, the heightened care needs of older persons, and overwhelmed health services. And in some places, women represent the majority of the health and care workforce. And then, it's now become a tragic but an established fact that gender-based violence, and in particular violence against women at home, domestic and intimate partner violence, has escalated during the pandemic. There's lots of different reasons why this is the case. It includes the increased stress and tension within households right now related to job loss and financial stress. Isolation is very disturbing. I think a lot of people are grappling with mental health problems right now as well. But because of the lockdown and because of isolation, people are confined in their homes with their abusers, and service centers have had to close down, or regular help and support services are not available. There's also been a rise in online gender-based violence, which actually exists in a sort of continuum with offline gender-based violence. And I think that this has been also sort of an overlooked area of the discussion. We've talked a lot about the global digital divide in the context of the pandemic and how the pandemic has exacerbated this. There's also an online gender digital divide, which relates to access to technology and how that is already gendered and different in different places. So, for example, in some contexts, maybe there is only one cell phone or one computer per family, and most often that will belong to the father or the husband. But women are traditionally more dependent on technology and internet access for skills development or education because of the barriers they face to attending school in a traditional or formal way. And taken together, all of what I just said, it's very disturbing, and it's, I think, reaching a tipping point that we're going to have to think about some creative solutions in order to come out of this okay. I was just reading last night about the dramatic rise in female suicides in Afghanistan since the pandemic began in relation to the increase in gender-based violence there. Where I live in Canada, women's participation in the labor force has reached its lowest level in 3 decades due to COVID-19. So the impacts, they're diverse and they're manifold, and they really need to be recognized and understood.
What are the next steps that international organizations and NGOs can take to rebuild better?
There's lots of thinking and ideas out there about this. Something that WILPF has put together with other feminist organizations is it's really centered around 5 key principles for a feminist recovery from COVID-19. I could run quickly through what those principles are. So first would be a recognition that health is a basic human right, and it's also a prerequisite for the equal and sustainable development of our societies. So we've seen the depletion of public healthcare infrastructures having a disproportionate impact on women, and that's been accelerated by COVID-19. That needs to be reversed immediately as part of a recovery effort. There's also a need to transform our economic systems in ways that will enable a successful COVID-19 recovery, and advance equality and justice and the social and economic well-being of people in tandem. Action needs to be taken today to address the rise in gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence, as we've just discussed. WILPF's also been doing some thinking. We need action to address environmental degradation, climate change, and the economic activities that drive the destruction of our environment, all of which have led to the emergence of COVID-19 and are impacting our recovery from the pandemic. And this really needs to be rooted in feminist perspectives of peace, equality, justice, and solidarity. And a part of that is also divestment, disarmament, and demilitarization in ways that will promote equity, justice, and human security, while freeing up new resources for investment into public, social, and health infrastructure. And a part of that is a necessity ceasefires. We heard the call from UN Secretary General for a global ceasefire at the start of the pandemic. That call was not heeded really widely, but it's a really important first step toward permanent peace and disarmed security. So maybe a takeaway message from these principles that I've just run through is that a COVID-19 recovery, it needs to address the failings and the consequences of existing policies that have for too long prioritized profit over the health and well-being of people and communities. And if these policies go unchanged, they will only compound the grave immediate impacts of the pandemic.
Thank you again for taking your time to join Nonviolence International New York and answering our questions so that we may shed some light to this issue and its importance in counteracting gender-based violence. We all look forward to seeing the publications that you and WILPF release in the future, and we thank you for your passion for researching human rights issues and pursuing avenues for international peace.